Welcome to the Alisa Childers podcast, where we equip Christians to identify the core beliefs of historic Christianity, discern its counterfeits, and proclaim the gospel with clarity, kindness, and truth. I have just finished a discussion with Neil Shenvi about Christian nationalism. I invited a co-host to come on with me this time, and that's Krista Bontrager. So Krista and I got to talk with Neil and ask him about what's the new developments in the Christian nationalist conversation. Now, if you recall, if you've been longtime listeners of the podcast, you'll remember that maybe a year ago, I did an episode about Christian nationalism with Neil. And you don't have to watch that one for this one to be relevant, but if you want to go back into the archives and listen to that one first, that'll lead you right up into the conversation we're having right now. So that was a review of the book, Taking America Back for God by Whitehead and Perry, who tend to lean a little bit more on the left side of things. That book caused a lot of people to use the Christian nationalist label at their political opponents, I guess you could say. But in the past couple of years, there have been more developments where there have been self-professed evangelical Christians making a positive case for Christian nationalism and saying, hey, yes, we are Christian nationalists. And so Neil also reviewed the book, The Case for Christian Nationalism by Stephen Wolfe. And so that's what we are interviewing him about today. But I really want you to listen to all the way to the end, because it was really like the last 30, 40 minutes where it just got so interesting as far as what this case that's being made, what are the spiritual ramifications, the physical ramifications. Ultimately, the case being that, Christians should implement the 10 commandments into civil law. That's essentially, as best I understand it, what the case that the book is making. And so Neil is going through a lot of his concerns about that. Of course, I'm very concerned about that viewpoint as well. So if you want to just be up to speed on the Christian nationalist conversation, this is the episode for you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Unshaken Faith podcast. That's my weekly little bite-sized podcast, 15-minute episodes with my good friend Natasha Crane, the Unshaken Faith podcast. And without any further ado, we're going to go ahead and get into this conversation with Neil and my co-host, Krista Bontrager. All right, Krista, you're my first co-host ever.
Wow,
How does
I
it
love
feel?
being first.
I know. You're the
Feeling
first
fancy.
one. I know. I feel like this is probably going to end up more like just a dialogue between the three of us, which I think will be great. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on to co-host this with me, I mean, you could have had Neil on your podcast and I could have had him on mine, but I think this will be a really fruitful conversation because you and I have talked quite a bit about the topic of Christian nationalism and the developments in that conversation. You have thought about it way more deeply than I have, and you've thought about political philosophy a lot more deeply than I have. So I thought it would be a great asset to have you on here to join me to ask some questions and join in the conversation. But tell us first, why are you interested in this conversation?
Well, I think, when Monique Duson and I, my ministry partner at the Center for Biblical Unity, started dialoguing about these issues very early on, when Monique was still kind of walking in the ways and the mindset of the critical social theories, one of her very first questions to me was basically, well, who decides, what the laws are? What is the standard? And I didn't have a very good answer for that. Mm-hmm. And that really was the first time that it put the question on my radar, that this was something that I needed to think about and reflect on a lot more deeply. And that has led me down a very long and winding road, like you said, of political philosophy. And I don't in any way want to pass myself off as an expert or as, having made up my mind completely. This is still very much a work in progress for me. And mm-hmm. I am still thinking through issues. And there's things I've spoken publicly about, from a political angle. I've done a lot of teaching on places where I see intersection between the Christian worldview and political issues, but there's a lot of things I haven't said publicly mm-hmm. because I am still learning.
That's good. Well, yeah, and this conversation is so interesting to me as well because of that same question Monique was asking you. It's like every law legislates morality, right? It tells us what we can do and can't do with our bodies and to other people. And that's all in the moral category of questions, which you either are grounding in an objective reality or it's going to be subjective. So these questions are very important for the Christian. But I want to go ahead and bring Neil into this conversation. Neil, so glad that you're joining us to continue our conversation on Christian nationalism. So just to kind of summarize, I want to direct our audience to our first episode that you can find in the archives. And we discussed the Whitehead and Perry book called Taking America Back for God, which really, to my knowledge, was the first sort of book that addressed Christian nationalism. And of course, it was being very critical of what they were calling Christian nationalism. Now, at the time, this was like when all of the chaos was happening. And it seemed to me at the time like anybody who was a Christian who also loved America and cared about politics was being lumped in with this Christian nationalist category. And I still feel that pressure, right? If you're a public Christian and you have anything to say about maybe abortion or that you love America or that you feel a deep sense of patriotism and commitment to your country, or if you think America is the greatest country, you're automatically labeled Christian nationalist. And I think that's still going on. But I want us to untangle this. I want us to discuss this from a biblical worldview. And then now fast forward to 2022, another book comes out. Now this is when, so up until this book came out, up until 2022, I was maintaining that, this is not a real thing. This is something that people are just, it's like a boogeyman. And maybe I wasn't being fair about that. Maybe there was more to be concerned about. But then along comes this book, and I start seeing it on social media where Christians are saying, yes, I am a Christian nationalist. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. Now I'm seeing people actually identify themselves as Christian nationalists and saying, here's why it's a good thing. And then they're posting links to this book. And then when I looked at the book, it seemed like it was selling quite well. But you said it actually hasn't sold. Maybe it just had a little burst of some activity and it hasn't sold that well. But this book is called The Case For Christian Nationalism by Stephen Wolfe. And you've reviewed this book. So tell us a little bit about that book. But first, let me see if Krista's got anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think when the book first came out, I think what surprised me is how it gained traction so quickly. I've watched several interviews with the author, Stephen Wolfe, and kind of understand his point of view. And I texted Alisa and I said, hey, you need to get this book on your radar because this is really becoming an influential voice in the conversation really quickly. And in fact, I had a private dinner with a very big, I would say, influencer, social media influencer, a couple of weeks after that book came out. And we were sitting at dinner, and if both of you know who this person is, but if we were sitting at dinner and he was said he was working his way through the book, and I started grilling him on all of my questions about it and what it was. And he was like, wow, so-and-so. And then he listed off like 2 or 3 people that he knew that this book had convinced them of Christian nationalism and other influencers that are in a similar stream as Monique and I. Then I started becoming kind of concerned at how quickly this was what I thought, influencing and reshaping the conversation. Like I'm still thinking this through, but battle lines were starting to be drawn really quickly. Are you for this vision or aren't you? And so I encourage Alisa to reach out to you so we can have this dialogue, because I think that even if the book sales, aren't like off the charts, I think this book is shaping the conversation for some people in evangelicalism. So I think it's good for us to talk about it.
So tell us about the book, Neil. What's the basic case it's making, and what's it all about?
Yeah, just be clear. I don't say it's selling badly. It's definitely selling more than my book. So that's your scale of bestseller. It's not Tom Clancy, right? But it's definitely it's doing fine. I just think it's probably reaching a niche audience is the point I would say.
Yes.
It's not reaching a broad. It's not. He's not going and doing interviews on Ben Shapiro or Joe Rogan. It's still kind of a niche book. So what's the main thesis? I think it's pretty clear that he's just saying that he thinks the ideal for a Christian nation is to be a Christian nation, which means he wants the nation to be explicitly in favor of Christianity and to discourage other religions, because he thinks the purpose of the government is to point its people, its citizens, to both earthly and heavenly good. So it's that we would say, people would say, well, the government's job is to keep the peace on earth. But no, he's like, no, the government's job is to point people towards heaven, and Christianity is true. Therefore, it means pointing people to Jesus explicitly. So that's a main purpose of the book. And then he dives into, well, what would that actually look like? He justifies that argument by appealing, we'll see in a second, not to scripture, but he basically starts with Reformed Protestant theologies, the theology of the Reformers, and Reformed political theology. And he says outright in the book, I'm not going to be appealing heavily to the Bible. I won't. I'm going to assume that the Reformers basically got the tradition right. Their teaching on these issues was correct, and they'll work from there. And so I think in the first 120 pages of the book, I think there's one Bible verse that he directly cites. And I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying it's just the way the book works. He's starting with the Reformers and then building from there, not going back to say, well, how do you exegete these following texts? He just doesn't. He says, I'm not a theologian. I'm a political scientist, so I'm going to start with political theology.
So this niche audience that we're talking about, I'd love to just focus on that a little bit, and then we can go into maybe some positives and negatives of the book. It seems to me like this is very much tied in with a very particular eschatology. Would I be right in saying that? That I'm seeing kind of at the same time, and Krista, you might be able to speak to this too, but it seems like at the same time, we're seeing sort of a resurgence. And I'm not saying this is I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that a particular eschatology leads one to these Christian nationalist conclusions. I'm not saying that. But it does seem to work best within the framework of like a post-millennial, even theonomy type of eschatology. And those who have begun to adopt this type of Christian nationalism have first adopted post-millennialism and then theonomy. Is that fair to say?
Is that for Krista or for me?
Either one. Krista might know better because you're really in this.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm seeing. I mean, those are most of the interview platforms that the author has been on. Not exclusively, but a lot of them, a good number of them, have been Reformed, post-millennial, and theonomy leaning or theonomy fully embracing. And by theonomy, we're just looking at, and I do follow many of these platforms on the regular. And, they're using the Westminster Confession definition of that, of, embracing the general equity of God's law. In other words, that God's law not only points forward to the sacrifice of Jesus, but that it also provides a foundation for a moral code. And that those principles behind that moral code are universally applicable and ought to form the basic framework for civil government. Now there's different streams within theonomy of how that works out and how different things are applied. But in the broadest way, these seem to be a large number of the people that the book appeals to.
And if anyone wants, I'm kind of new to the whole theonomy conversation. So if anybody else is like, what are all these words and what are they talking about? I'm going to recommend a video that really helped me kind of understand. This is a video between Joel Webbin, who is a theonomist, and Mike Winger, who many of my audience know Mike. And Joel's a nice guy. I've been on his podcast. And basically, Joel is trying to convince Mike Winger to become a theonomist. And, Mike didn't go for it. But it's a great conversation to kind of learn the theology behind where that's coming from. And then I think for people who are trying to connect the dots, that'll help connect the dots to what we're talking about here. So, okay, that I didn't mean to take such a left turn there, but let's get back to the book, Neil. Obviously there are some instincts in the book that we can all relate with, right? There's questions being asked, maybe identifications of some legitimate problems. What would you say is good about the book? What's the positive takeaways, if there are any?
So one surprising point is that Wolfe's Christian nationalism really diverges in some ways from pop Christian nationalism. We're talking about like, guns and Jesus and flags in the sanctuary, and you sing the Star Spangled Banner and in before service. That kind of pop Christian nationalism, which again Whitehead and Perry probably would point to, is like that's what we're talking about. Well, Wolfe actually diverges sharply from that perspective in some ways. So, for example, he says, quote, "I'm ambivalent about national flags located inside or outside churches, but national flags should not be displayed in a sanctuary, and especially not within sight during worship." Like, that's not, again, when I think of like, again, Christian nationalism, I'm thinking of, red, white, and blue on the pews and like everywhere. But he's like, no. Because, and why? Because he believes that the pastor is, another quote, "Christian spirituality and worship are properly speaking about eternal life, not political struggle. Thus, pastors should not, in their official capacities at least, be social activists or political coordinators, especially from the pulpit." You're again like, wait a minute, that's not the vision in my head I have of quote unquote Christian nationalism. And so he says elsewhere, he says a Christian nation, any Christian nation, is not a holy nation in the sense that Israel was holy when under the Mosaic covenant. No nation today is God's nation by some special divine command or by exclusive divine favor. So these are all things that just fly in the face of, again, pop, quote unquote, Christian nationalism. So that's actually refreshing that I actually think I would agree with all those statements. So again, that's interesting. Another thing is that he does rely heavily on historic Protestant political theory. Like it or not, a lot of the early reformers, and for centuries, would have been strong supporters of the kinds of things that Wolfe is outlining. He's retrieving their view of the government and monarchy, things like that. I mean, he's not a monarchist per se, but they supported the monarchy. They supported, rulers and not democracy for certain. So they did not have a very positive view of religious freedom, and certainly not in our terms. So he's retrieving that. He's not pulling this out of the air. He's going back to the Reformation and saying, well, what did they think, and why not start there and apply it today? He also challenges what's called classical liberalism, meaning this idea that everything's about individual rights and freedoms and autonomy and liberty and maybe consent. And he points out problems with that view, which is very popular today. And I think I would consider myself a classical liberal, a pragmatic one, but I think I am. And so a lot of the criticisms I'm hearing, I think, are valid. And frankly, I think a lot of classical liberals out there, evangelicals, they're soft intellectually. They just take for granted, well, of course, religious freedom is awesome. And I'd say, well, why do you believe that? Well, of course it's awesome. But why? It's just obvious. Well, we need to have something more than just relying on our intuition. I have that intuition. I'm a child of I had 1979. I'm 43. I grew up just obviously these things are good, but we have to ask, well, what does the Bible say? And so I think it's good for him to push that. So, for example, here's a point I don't know if he made it or I've thought about it since reading his book, but we don't really have absolute religious freedom, even today in the U.S. And you can't have it. For example, some religions demand human sacrifice.
Right.
Aztec religion, right? We don't have that. What about temple prostitution? That's illegal. Well, that's not fair. You're prohibiting their free exercise of religion. Yeah, no, that's right. You can't not do that. Drug laws. Some religions prescribe taking hallucinogenic drugs. We say we say okay. Sometimes we say no. The point is there is no possibility of absolute unfettered religious freedom. We're always going to prohibit, say, human sacrifice. Now you can say, well, that's because it violates the right to life. Okay, but you're pitting now absolute religious freedom against another right. Which right wins? We've decided, well, right to life wins. Okay, but you don't have absolute religious freedom. Another point, harm. We like to say, well, laws should be about harm. And what kind of harm? Well, with physical harm. Like you can't punch people, you can't kill them. But wait a minute, there are other categories of harm that we recognize in the law. Libel. If you print lies that damage someone's reputation, you can sue someone. Public nuisances. You can't go and play your radio in the street at 3 a.m. full blast. You can't do that. Obscenity. You can't walk around naked. You can't perform sex acts. You can't sell child porn. You're not physically harming people, but we know of course you can't do that. But why? Because we're limiting freedom. We're limiting certain expressions that we've deemed to be they're harms, but they're not physical harms. So Wolfe asked, well, what about spiritual harm? Like if people really, really, really want to worship demons, why do we say, well, that's fine? But why? Is it not harming them? It's harming them. As Christians, we know it is. So why should we say, well, it's got to be legal though? But why? Again, I'm not saying yes or no. I'm just saying why.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, Wolfe realizes that there are pragmatic considerations in all these issues. We're trading off one kind of freedom for another kind. Or, the freedom is good, but there's a bad thing that comes out of it. So how do we balance that? So his point is you have to exercise prudence. You have to realize there are trade-offs. And he says, yeah, the reformers got some things wrong. They had religious wars. They slaughtered each other by the millions. That's bad. We should learn from that. But we should also learn from the fact that our current, the government today and the culture today is going in the other direction, leading to incredibly terrible laws and bad public morality. Shouldn't there be some pushback and say, wait, how did we get here? So anyway, those are positives. I think challenging liberals. And then finally, I'll stop in a second. I'm net critical of the book, so I like to provide some positives to balance it out. But finally, I think he gives a really good defense of cultural Christianity. Some people have celebrated the fact that cultural Christianity is on the decline. And he says, why would you do that? So here's 2 points that I think come through. One is that if you love your neighbor, you want them to be in a Christian culture and to absorb Christian values and intuitions. So, for example, if a non-Christian husband does not commit adultery because he grew up in a Christian culture that told him, well, adultery is bad and you're a bad person if you commit it, right? Doesn't make him a Christian. If he avoids adultery because he just feels ashamed for it, and he says, I want to fit in, I don't want to be ostracized, so I don't commit adultery, doesn't make you a Christian or even a virtuous person. You're just doing it because you want to feel better than other people. But your child grows up in a non-broken home. If a non-Christian woman doesn't abort her baby because she's been told her whole life, well, you can't do that. No good Christian does that, so she does not abort the child, does not make her a Christian, but it means her baby lives. So he's pointing out, look, you might sneer at, oh, these people aren't real Christians, they're hypocrites. Yeah, but they're still getting the blessing of obeying God's law, even if they do it not out of true love for God, but out of fear or out of guilt. But they're still living in some ways, a more flourishing life than if they'd grown up in a broken home and aborted their child. So his point is, we should not be cheering for people to lose that basic moral grounding that comes from a Christian culture. That's a bad thing. It's a sad thing. We don't want more broken homes and aborted babies, right?
Yeah.
And then the final thing is that it's like, look, if you're really concerned about creating hypocrites, yes, yeah, Christian culture produces good church-going people who on the inside are spiritually dead. He agrees with that, by the way. He said cultural Christianity can, by itself, can produce nothing but hypocrites. He completely agrees. But his question still is, do you really believe that it's a net bad thing for evangelism? So do you think there are more Christians in Mississippi or in North Korea or in Iran? You get lots of hypocrites in Mississippi. I agree. But you also get many genuine believers because they are taught categories like law and gospel, grace and forgiveness, right and wrong, good and evil. And they're taught a basic Christian framework. And then when they hear the gospel, it makes sense to them, as opposed to someone who grew up in, say, North Korea, worshiping their leader and thinking he's God. Well, that's going to make it harder for you to understand the categories of the gospel. So anyway, all those are all positives. And Krista, I don't know if you want to chime in. I don't want to take all my time here.
Yeah, no, I think that's a feature that I have grown in my appreciation for. When I think about somebody like my father and his generation, even though he grew up in an abusive home and without a dad and having so much difficulty in his life, he also grew up in an era of the Boy Scouts and going to summer camp where they had some kind of civil religion as part of the summer camp experience. And those things gave him a kind of a moral framework, even though, he wasn't a Christian. But it helped him think about his life of like the benefits of being honest and making an honest living and working hard and these sorts of things. And that there is some inherent virtue in that. And we see that, I think there's a scriptural premise for that. I mean, when we look in, for example, the prophet Amos, God brings judgment against Gentile nations when they violate certain eternal moral principles.
Mm-hmm.
That God will only tolerate injustice and particular kinds of injustice for so long.
Mm-hmm.
He will allow that to go along for a while, but there does seem to be a precedent in Scripture that God expects Gentile nations to obey certain basic principles of his eternal moral law.
Mm-hmm.
And that is persuasive to me. And I think that there's something to that idea of a civil religion. And I don't like the word religion, but maybe we could call it religious or Christian-based civil ethics code or something
Mm-hmm.
of that nature. And that we have enjoyed that in our country for, 200 plus years. I think that there's some biblical grounding for that and a case for that can be made. And I think we're seeing some of the fruits of transitioning away from that framework in our cultural moment right now. And as we're kind of engaging in, whatever we want to call the social shifts that are happening right now, we're seeing a different moral framework rise up and take its place.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, Neil, about some of your thoughtful concerns and reflections about Wolfe's book and his project, because I'd really like to get into that and hear what you have to say. And I do want to commend to everyone to read Neil's very fine, long review on his website at shenviapologetics.com to just get even deeper into the details there. But let's talk a little bit about some of your concerns about the book.
Sure. So I mentioned one. Let me just read Wolfe's summary of what a Christian nation would look like, just so you guys get a sense of what he himself says. This is the goal. This is what we're looking at when we talk about a Christian nation. He says, a Christian society that is for itself as a Christian nation will distrust atheists, decry blasphemy, correct any dishonoring of Christ, orient life around the Sabbath, frown on and suppress moral deviancy, and repudiate neo-Anabaptist attempts to subvert a durable Christian social order. So, he's envisioning a society that's very different than the one we have today. Certainly, I think we could minimum say that. So we'll get into that, but that's how he describes this, the sort of ideal society with a Christian leader. So what are some concerns I have? So again, I said very little Bible. That's not necessarily bad, but he's assuming. So I assume the Reformed tradition. So I make little effort to exegete the biblical text. So he says page 16. He's going to start there, and if you don't buy that assumption, then well, you have to go back and figure out whether the Reformed tradition is true or not. So I'm not going to, again, I'm just saying, I'm pointing out that it makes it hard for evangelicals to evaluate his arguments, because if you are Reformed and you buy that tradition and you think that he's using it properly, I'm not a theologian or a political theologian, so I can't even tell you whether he's using the sources properly. But if he is, assuming he is, for average evangelicals, you can't say, well, this verse contradicts what you said, or this, you're not exegeting this properly, because he's not doing that. He's just saying, well, so-and-so says this, right? So, okay, is he right or wrong? He's not the Bible. So it's hard for a Christian who's good at the Bible, but maybe bad at, say, some of these reformers to evaluate what he's saying. Okay. Here's a big problem. He doesn't define the word nation clearly or precisely, and he says he doesn't. He says the idea of nation is notoriously difficult to define, and identifying true nations is equally challenging. My interest, however, is not to discuss and identify nations and nationhood. So wait a minute. If you're going to call your book Christian Nationalism, and you're not sure what a nation is, he's kind of like, well, we just kind of know it when you see it. Well, that's going to become very important if you're going to build a Christian nation. They're like saying, I'm all about Christian Shemationalism. Well, what's a Christian Shemation? Well, I don't know really, but I'm just saying I'm all about Christian Shemationalism. You have to define what that word means, and it's going to be very important in a second. So, but he never says clearly, well, what is a nation? He doesn't really say. The closest he comes is a nation is a group of people who see themselves as a people. Does that make sense? That if you conceive of yourself as a people who are my people, we share a language, a culture, and ancestry, actually is part of it, then you're a nation. So sharing all those things in some sense makes you a nation. Okay. But he doesn't define it clearly, and that becomes a problem. Here's a big one, though. When he imagines the ideal system, not a realistic one, but ideal one, he talks about the Christian prince. That's his ideal civil magistrate, the ruler of the Christian nation. He calls a Christian prince. And here's some quotes from his book. Having the highest office on earth, the good prince, the Christian prince, resembles God to the people. Indeed, he is the closest image of God on earth. The prince, and again, the prince is a sort of national God, not in the sense of being divine himself, or in materially transcending common humanity, or as an object of prayer or spiritual worship, or as a means of salvific grace, but as a mediator of divine rule for this nation and as one with divinely granted power to direct them in their national completeness. That's 287, 288. Here's another one. This is, okay, you brace yourself. The Christian prince can adorn himself and his residence, his house, with Christian symbols, as crosses were once painted on royal armor. His military or militia, which defends a Christian people and their church, can be designated soldiers of Christ. That's 296, 297. Earlier, I identified the prince as the mediator of civil rule, and I described him in godlike terms following scripture. The prince is an image of Christ to his people, page 309. And okay, here's, I don't know how much we have here. There's more to it. Two more. No, here's just one more. The Christian prince has the power to call synods, so meetings of the church leaders, in order to resolve doctrinal conflicts and to moderate the proceedings, and can confirm or deny their theological judgments. And in confirming them, they become the settled doctrine of the land. So he's envisioning a Christian, a ruler. It's a political ruler, he's very clear, not a pastor, not a church official, he's a political ruler, but he has sort of authority to say this doctrine is our nation's doctrine. And that he says he consults with theologians and pastors like a wise father would consult his medically trained son on matters of medicine, right? You consult your son if he's a doctor, but in the end, you're the dad. And so you say this doctrine is now the official national church doctrine for the land. Okay.
I have so many questions. Can I pop in with a couple of questions
Sure.
and then I'll let you continue? But
yeah.
I mean, I have so many questions right now.
Okay.
So in his view, would this effectively end denominations? And could it lead to persecution? Let's say that he decides and, wisely or whatever decides that the official doctrine of America is, Reformed cessationism, let's say.
Yeah.
Are charismatics and Arminians going to be persecuted in his view, or will there be legislation made against those views? I mean, is that what this could lead to?
Okay, so he would say that that the Christian prince has the authority to enforce right doctrine. And now he does point out that even in the Puritan era New England, which was very little religious freedom, but he points out that they have the reputation of being these dour, strict, terrible. But actually, he said they were actually very willing to accept non-conforming or people that were outside their denomination into their churches. They knew like there's not like a First Baptist and First Presbyterian and every street corner in New England. So they welcomed in their Baptist brothers and said, hey, you can worship with us. You can't make our church a Baptist church. You can't you can't teach Baptist theology, but you're a brother in Christ. You can fellowship with us. So they were very open to that kind of he called it pan-Protestant ecumenism, right? They wanted to have all Protestants who worship the same Jesus, who believe the same basic doctrines, to worship together. They were okay with that, as long as they didn't disrupt the Commonwealth, they didn't disrupt town life, etc. So I think he'd say in theory, if you're talking about people who are actually teaching heresy, that the Christian prince has the authority to even execute them. Actually says in one spot, he says, here we go, page 359. The question is whether a Christian magistrate, having civil rule over a civil society of Christians, may punish with civil power false teachers, heretics, blasphemers, and idolaters for their external expression of such things in order to prevent, 1, any injury to the souls of the people of God, 2, the subversion of Christian government, Christian culture, or spiritual discipline, or 3, civil disruption or unrest. So basically, if you're a heretic or a blasphemer or an idolater, can you be punished for just, for hurting the souls of Christians, for leading them astray, for subverting Christian government or culture, or for causing civil disruption or unrest? He says, modern religious liberty advocates deny this, and I affirm it. So the Christian magistrate can punish all those categories of people, including false teachers and heretics, with civil punishments. Here's one more. All right, Alisa, hold on. Buckle up.
I'm trying.
Grab something. Okay. Arch heretics. So people that are heretics will do not let go of their doctrine. They've been admonished. They will not listen. So arch heretics who are publicly persistent in their damnable error and actively seek to convince others of this error, to subvert the established church, to denounce its ministers, or to instigate rebellion against magistrates, can be justly put to death. Page 391. This is not, he adds, but this is not to say that capital punishment is the necessary, sole, or desired punishment. Banishment and long-term imprisonment may suffice as well. So, I think it's very clear from this. At a minimum, he's saying that the Christian prince, in an ideal situation, has the authority to execute capital punishment against people who just will not give up their heresy and go teach it in public. The end result is death penalty, maybe banishment, maybe imprisonment. And then that extends, though, to, what about if you're a Baptist? He's a Presbyterian, and he says actually at one point that Baptist theology does not really go well with Christian nationalism, because he says, I should find the quote, but he says, I'll find it later. But okay, the bottom line is that, wait a minute, are you going to put Baptists in jail? Because that happened once upon a time in England. So are we going to start jailing Baptists? I'm a Baptist. I don't really want to go to jail, even, especially at the hands of a fellow brother in Christ. Mm-hmm. But he would say, no, in an ideal world, maybe where everyone was a Presbyterian and you're just this obstinate Baptist who refuses to just come to church and you just want to shout in the government and call us all terrible. Well, eventually we're going to say, you have to go to jail. You're breaking the law. But he'd be in favor in a pluralistic society, in a society filled with non-Christians and all kinds of people with atheists. We'd have to use prudence, is the word he uses a lot, prudence. You can't just go from modern America, 2023, in 6 months you're going to be, what's the Handmaid's Tale, the state of Gideon or something like. You can't, Gilead, yeah. You can't flip a switch and do that. You have to exercise prudence in how much religious control can you exercise? And clearly in our nation like ours, you can't do that. So he's envisioning a pan-Protestant nation that basically looks something like America in, say, the pre-war America, 1920s, 30s, where culturally you had cultural Christianity, you had presidents quoting the Bible, it was expected everyone would go to church. He's saying it's not ideal for him, but it's the sort of the best we can do with what we have. So, but in theory, he's okay with all the things he said. In principle, that's not unjust.
Well, I want to take a moment and tell you about today's sponsor, Good Ranchers. Guys, for a long time, I have really cared about the quality of meat that I buy for my family, that I cook dinners with. And I didn't know until recently that over 70% of the meat that you buy in the grocery store, even the super fancy, foofy grocery stores, is imported from overseas. And that's why I love Good Ranchers. Not only do I love Good Ranchers because the meat just tastes amazing, I love that the chicken is triple trimmed. I also love that the standards on the chicken is what is called better than organic. If you've been following the organic standards, they've been lowering them as time goes by over the past few years. And so Good Ranchers gives you chicken that's better than organic. So you get 100% American grown, hand trimmed steakhouse quality meat delivered right to your door. We love it. We eat Good Ranchers meat almost every night that I cook in the home. So if you want to go to goodranchers.com/Alisa, make sure you use the code Alisa to get $30 off any box you get in February. So again, that's goodranchers.com/Alisa. Good Ranchers, American meat delivered.
I guess I'm wondering, this is something I have not heard him address in interviews, is where would that leave our Roman Catholic and Orthodox friends? Because they're not Protestants.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I mean, because obviously it leaves out Muslims, Jews, Hindus, atheists, but what would he do with Catholics and Orthodox people?
So I think that actually, again, he hasn't addressed this specifically. I think that given what he says and hints at in the book, he's not saying that the U.S., in even the best case scenario, that given the pluralism of our country today, we're not gonna kick out even maybe Hindus and Jews. We're not gonna do that. We're gonna tolerate them, but we're not going to promote them. We're not gonna say how awesome it is. Because as a Christian nation, this is him speaking, by the way, not me. But I think he would say, we'll tolerate other religions, tolerate them, but we're going to discourage them, right? We're not going to throw them in jail, but we're not going to you have your displays and you have the Satanic Temple wants to put up a display. You do it too. No, you're not. That's illegal. So he would be totally willing to draw the line at certain and say, no, we're not going to have Satan worship in this country. I'm sorry, you'll go to jail. But I think he probably would be open to saying, yeah, we're going to tolerate Catholics and Orthodox and then even maybe Jews and Muslims. But we're going to be a Christian pan-Protestant nation officially.
With the ideal of eventually over time, over generations, shifting people more and more into this kind of pan-Protestant ideal. And the analogy that's often used by these advocates is the reason they're talking about Presbyterianism so much is because of the idea in Presbyterianism of covenant families, covenant language, and covenant children. So because I baptize my child into the covenant, but when they get older, they might walk away from their faith. But as long as the father's in the home, the father is the one who is enforcing that the child go to church and be obedient and honor their parents. And so the government is sort of compared to the father. And this is why Presbyterianism is the framework. And there was a big dust up after the book came out where there was some jokes that were made of like, well, Baptists, really can't be the ideal Christian nationalists because...
Oh, there's a quote. Let me read the quote here. There it is. Okay. I got it right in front of me. He says, quote, infant Baptist is the position most natural. Infant baptism is the position most natural for baptizing infants, brings them outwardly, at least into the people of God. So infant baptism fits with Christian nationalism. Why? Listen, when the body politic, so the body of people in a society, when the body politic is baptized into the Christian nation, all are people of God. Credo baptism, believers' baptism that Baptists practice, credo baptism likely creates problems for Christian nationalism. It is no accident that Baptists tend to be advocates of near absolute religious liberty. That's not only due to their tradition of dissent. So he's saying his vision is when you make the nation a Christian nation, that in some real sense, everybody becomes the people of God. Not just in some but he's not saying they're all Christians internally, but externally, they're expected to conform to God's will and to obey God's law, just like the baptized baby is. And he says, actually, that whole framework is Presbyterian. It's not Baptist. Baptists don't think that you baptize a non-believing infant and then expect it to act like a Christian. We have a whole other theology of what baptism is. Anyway, so he makes the point himself that that doesn't really fit well with Baptist theology because anyway, so he says it himself.
So this is why this framework has so much appeal, I think, to Reformed and Presbyterian people, why it's gaining traction, in certain theonomic circles. But there are Reformed and theonomic Baptists. And so that was a bit of a conversation early on after the book was released. I think another important thing to point out about this book, Neil, and I'd love to have us explore a little bit, is his embedded with his definition of a nation, of kind of people that associate together and having these voluntary associations together. how he talks about the issues of race and ethnicity. I think this has been an issue of great confusion. There were a lot of Twitter threads early on after the book was released, characterizing Wolfe as a racist. So I want us to spend a little time understanding his highly, I'm going to call it nuanced and a little bit unusual position about that issue.
That's exactly right. I think the biggest, most problematic part of the book is how he deals with ethnicity and nation. So he always talked about how he doesn't really define nation clearly. He just doesn't. It's not his interest. But he doesn't define nation very clearly and precisely. He also uses the terms nation and ethnicity synonymously. He says, I use the terms ethnicity and nation almost synonymously. With slight differences in when he uses which, but they're basically synonymous. So normally so what you're saying is you're for Christian nationalism, but if ethnicity and nationalism are the same to you, then you're kind of talking about Christian ethno-nationalism. Because he's like, no. Well, wait a minute. Well, then pick. I'm like, it's a really poor choice of words. It's super duper duper unwise to use the term ethnicity because for example, he says that, so here's what he says. So he's saying, okay, nation means some kind of a people group that are united in culture, language, and feeling of they are a people group, they're their own people, they're my people, okay? And he uses the word nation or ethnicity interchangeably. We're like, but wait a minute, ethnicity normally means like Hispanic, French, European. That's what ethnicity, Asian, Chinese, American, something like that. But he doesn't mean that, I think, but it's a terrible choice of words. Yeah. But let's assume that he just means, ethnicity just means a people group, like a nation. Okay. But here's what he says about it. This is still wrong, even if you grant his weird definition. He says this: people of different ethnic groups can exercise respect for difference, conduct some routine business with each other, join in interethnic alliances for mutual good, and exercise common humanity, like the Good Samaritan. But they cannot have a life together that goes beyond a mutual alliance. They cannot have a life together that goes beyond mutual alliance. Now, that's not true. Now, he says elsewhere, not in the book, in the Twitter, he's like, well, I just meant a political life. And I'm thinking, but look, for a Christian, we don't primarily think in terms of political life. Life together means a life together, like, for example, in the church. Yeah. And so the example I give is when I was in New Haven, my men's Bible study included a Romanian math grad student, a medical student from Ghana, a white hedge fund manager, a part Native American, part black carpenter, and me who's F Indian. So we were, by no definition of ethnicity, were we the same ethnicity. We were literally from other countries, but we loved each other. We did life together. And what do you think? We're not voting together, but some of these people are U.S. citizens even. So what is that whole vision that we can't really, because they're not my people. They are my people because they're Christ's people. And so that very way of thinking, maybe it's just thinking too much in terms of politics, but I'm saying we have to think not in terms of politics primarily, but in terms of the church and Christian unity. Now, he makes the point, well, look, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean that you can really relate to some person who doesn't speak your language. Like they literally can't communicate with you. There's some wonderful Christian person, but they're living in Bhutan and don't speak your language at all. You have a great unity in Christ, yes, but you can't work, you can't talk. So I get that, but still, thinking in those terms, and he's talking again about, it seems like on occasion he's talking about, again, the standard definition of ethnicity is like my people that you relate to. That's a very corrosive idea for Christians to say, I can't really relate to you because, yeah, sure, we're both Christians and maybe we both speak English, but you're not my people. I'm like, that's not how the Bible talks about who's people. I read my review, but New Testament has over 100 references to other Christians using familial language like brothers, the household of God. Peter in 1 Peter says to the Christians, you are a chosen race. The Greek is genos, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, ethnos, where we get the term ethnicity. He calls Christians a holy nation. So for the Bible, they are thinking in terms of the Christian as a peoples, genos, ethnos, people for God's own possession. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. So it's almost reverse of how Wolfe's thinking. Now, he has reasons for why he thinks that, on a natural level, cultures and natural familial units have to take priority for politics over our unity in Christ. He wouldn't deny unity in Christ. But I'm saying if you look at the way the Bible talks about these categories, it reverses that. It's more concerned about unity in Christ than about politics and alliances and forming governments. So I'm willing to say maybe he's just not wording this very carefully, or maybe we're misunderstanding him. But I would really hesitate, and for other reasons, I have very big concerns about how he's thinking about ethnicity and nationalism. And while there's much more I could go, I think maybe I'll just say this, because let me just be frank. Racism within Christian nationalism as a broad movement is a very real concern. It really is. And here, let me point out some things here. Now, it'll be some about Wolfe and some about other people. But before his book was published, Wolfe there's a Twitter discussion about intergroup marriage, like any kind of intergroup marriage. And Wolfe tweeted, while intermarriage is not itself wrong as an individual matter, groups have a collective duty to be separate and marry among themselves. And so people kind of probe, but what do you mean groups have to be separate? And he responds to this. He said this: there's a difference between something being sinful absolutely and something being sinful relatively. Interethnic marriage can be sinful relatively, but not absolutely. Now, to be fair, he deleted those tweets and he went on CrossPolitic on an interview and offered a bit of retraction and said he was just thinking out loud about, well, do groups have a duty to preserve their culture? And if so, does it harm the group culture if you intermarry heavily with some other group because you lose the culture? So, okay. So he took it back. He said, well, I can see why it's confusing. So, okay. But here's another point. Okay. So I'm totally willing to say, okay, you clarified, you're not saying interethnic marriage is wrong. You're not saying that. But then a few weeks after the book was published, it was discovered that the co-host of Wolfe's podcast, which he'd done for, I think, 2.5 years, that co-host owned a Twitter account that posted really vile white supremacist content, not like the modern version, like actual, like calling people racial slurs, some pornography, things like that. And actually, that same co-host had an essay posted on a white nationalist website. And in that essay, the co-host argued that we need to promote the use of, get this, critical race theory. Why? Because that will encourage a white racial consciousness and solidarity. He wanted that. He wanted to embrace CRT because that's going to push whites to create a white identity. Right? Now, when that was discovered, so all these tweets were discovered, it was the co-host. So Wolfe repudiated the tweets. He's like, I did not know these were his. I repudiate them. And he said, I had no idea that was him. And he repudiates them now. But I'm again taking him at his word. My only point is this: there is a problem within this Christian nationalist community with just outright racism.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm opposed very clearly to critical race theory. And one reason is because it's going to divide the church. And now you have people who are outright saying, as whites, we should embrace CRT because it will divide the church. And we like that. We want whites to rise up and become racially conscious. I'm like, I'm sorry. I reject CRT when progressives use it. And I reject CRT when conservatives use it because I reject CRT as a Christian. So I think, and there's, one more example. I'm sorry I'm taking up so much time. But
this is great. No, keep going.
Okay. A few weeks later, I basically said, I think there are bullets to bite. Like, classical liberals can just buckle down and bite the bullet and say, we're going to allow drag queen story hour. We disagree with it, but it's the price of liberty. We're just going to go ahead and do it. And that's, I think that's bad. I think we shouldn't do that. But they're biting the bullet. They're being consistent. And I said, on the other hand, Christian nationalists have some bullets to bite. For example, do you want to make Hindu temples illegal? And I thought that was going to be we don't want to do that. But I was surprised that actually hundreds of Christian nationalists, self-identified Christian nationalists, poured onto my Twitter webpage and said, absolutely, Hindu temples should be illegal. Absolutely. There's no, obviously, this is clear. And then some of them even told me, these are self-identified Christian nationalists, go back to India. And these are Christian nationalists saying this. I'm like, oh, guys, I'm from Delaware, but whatever. Yeah. Okay. I'm not offended. And then actually, well, those are just nutcases on Twitter. I mean, some of them have pretty big followings, but whatever. Twitter's a sewer. I get that. But here's the thing. So then another guy came on in the midst of this discussion. A guy came on to my website and said this. He said, he said basically the white men's got conquered by immigrants don't belong here, and white men are being oppressed by immigrants, and they need to leave our country. So I made some joke about how, as I said, actually, other people were here before the Europeans were, right? Here's what he said. This is another rando on Twitter. I get it. He said, Europeans didn't immigrate. We conquered. We put the native demon worshippers to the sword and took the land for Christ. The Lord took most of the rest by plague. But since the invasion began in the 1960s, that's the immigrant invasion, the life of the white man has gotten immensely worse, and you know it. Okay, now, again, rando on Twitter. I'm not saying he's speaking for anybody. He self-identifies as a Christian fascist. He's not a Christian nationalist even. But here's the thing. After that tweet, I posted the tweet and was like, this is crazy stuff. The Twitter account of Gab CEO Andrew Torba responded to that vile tweet, "Go off, King." Now, Torba recently wrote a book entitled Christian Nationalism, a biblical guide for taking dominion and discipling nations, and he is notorious for posting anti-Semitic tweets. And that guy's book, Torba's book, he's the CEO of Gab, he has 300,000 followers. His book on Christian nationalism has 3 times the upvote to the reviews as Wolfe's book on Amazon. So now, again, I'm not saying Wolfe endorses any of that.
Right.
I'm not saying that. Absolutely not. In fact, I actually DM'd him. I asked him explicitly, what did I say? I said something like, are you opposed to interracial marriage? I think he said flatly no. And I said, can people of different ancestries, like a Japanese person and a white person, can they be the same ethnicity? He said yes, because the thing is basically about your people. So if a guy came from Japan and his family immigrated, 60 years ago, and he's come to America and he's now, an American, he's an American. That's his ethnicity. So he's saying that, yeah, ethnicity in Wolfe's mind is not race. It's not ethnicity means basically, I mean, it's hard to say, but it's definitely affirming that he's not saying interethnic marriage is wrong. He's not saying, when he talks about ethnicity, he's not saying Japanese Americans and white Americans are different ethnicities. He's saying you can both be the American ethnicity or something like that. Okay. I'm just saying this. There are plenty of self-identified Christian nationalists who are straight up racist. Okay, I'm not accusing you just because you happen to identify as a Christian nationalist. I'm not saying you're a racist. I'm just saying it's a problem within this big tent movement that you need to be aware of. That's all I'm saying.
And that is very consistent with what I have seen as well. And I think that Wolfe's answer I heard him give on one interview, I think, was like, and to him, if you have 2 people that we would call different ethnicity, let's say a European background and a Japanese person, if they're willing to fight and die to defend their land in America, then they're the same. They're the
ethnicity,
same
right.
Ethnicity, according to his definition.
Right.
That it's about shared affiliation and shared beliefs that we will defend this ground. We will fight and die for our nation. And so it would be a straw man to call Wolfe, I think, a white supremacist.
Right. He says he's not interested at all in racial categories. It's not what he's thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's confusing because he has a novel definition that seems to be excluded to one person in terms of how he's using it. But in the Christian nationalist movement more broadly, when you posted that tweet about, we don't want to make Hindu temples illegal, I knew you were in for trouble. Like when you posted it.
Here's the thing. I almost posted, you don't want to make synagogues illegal. And I thought, you know what? Just in case, I won't post that because I don't want to see what crawls out of the woodwork to say, yes, we do want that. And some people actually, like I actually asked the Torba or his account, I don't know if it's his personal account or his CEO account. But I actually asked, well, what about synagogues? And he just kind of coyly posted a meme, like, we'll wait and see. Like, he didn't say yes or no, but he wouldn't say, well, no, not those. So anyway, the point is just that, and we'll get into this, I think, this is why I think Christians should not use the label Christian nationalism. They should not use it. There are many reasons why, but this is one, because you're going to be sharing a tent with some really vile people. And so for many reasons, one of them is prudence. You don't want to do that. Just wait until you get this great movement of yours. Then some CNN reporter sticks their mic in the front of some neo-Nazi who has a humongous following. And he says, yes, I'm a Christian nationalist, and we believe in, deporting all the brown people. And you're like, uh-oh, there goes your movement. And there are other reasons too. I mean, okay, we don't want to rant here. Guys, what I'm seeing is a repeat of the woke movement in the church. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, woke evangelicals were using these language of social justice and systemic oppression, all this stuff. And a few people like me, and other people too, but we said, hey guys, I don't think you want to use those terms, because those terms are being used by some people that they're not Christians, and they have some really, really bad ideas. But a lot of people within the woke movement didn't listen. They circled the wagons. They're like, how dare you? You're just racist. You don't like justice. They wouldn't listen and say, hey, you're circling your wagons around a few wolves, not all, but some. And 5 years later, what happened? Well, because they were committed to their tribe, we're on the team justice. What happened was their own theology started getting off, because they were like, well, they're kind of my people now. So I want to defend I don't want to just protect the wolves or even ignore the wolves. I'm kind of going to defend the wolves a little bit, because they just care about justice so much. What I'm worried about is not only if you're going to build a big movement, a political movement, and get consensus and build a coalition, you don't need people like this in your movement. It's going to kill your movement. But apart from that, I'm worried about your theology. You start circling your wagons around these people that they're sinning. You're going to start saying, well, they kind of have a point, maybe. Maybe I'm too harsh on them. Guys, this is what happened 5 years ago to the woke church. You don't go this route. I'm saying I'm not trying to embarrass you or chide you. I'm just saying, hey, we have an example of this happening. It's only 5 years old. Please don't do it again.
But I think that this is where theonomy comes in, is that from their perspective, they don't believe that it's just commandments 5 through 10 that should be part of the civil moral law. They think that we should also make commandments 1 to 4 part of the civil moral law. So we're going to have Sabbath laws. We're going to have anti-blasphemy laws. And the way they're couching the conversation is, if you don't get on board with us, if you don't get on board with our vision, you're compromising scripture. There's only 2 options available. There's either you're on team God and God's law is eternal and that sort of a thing. And that includes, we're not going to have Hindu temples, or you're on, kind of the classical liberal, which is really, let's just be honest, it's one breath away from being a progressive, and this is how I'm seeing it in Christian circles, how the conversation is being painted is, well, it's not enough that you're just for the general equity of the moral law. You have to be for the general equity of all 10 commandments. This is where the connection of theonomy comes in.
And I will say too, I know people who embrace theonomy who, like in my personal life, when I shared some of this information with, they were like, oh my gosh, no, I'm not for this. I'm not for what that's talking about. So I don't want to paint everybody as the same. But this is really deeply disturbing. And it's disturbing because if we look at history, when culture gets chaotic, when things get chaotic as they've been, and people start swinging to these real big extremes, and like they react to one thing with the, just the pendulum goes all the way to the other side. I mean, that's what can set things up for violence and just all manner of terrible things. I don't have a better word.
Okay. Well, I will share one more quote to frighten you.
Okay, good.
I promise to stop. So one question, of course, that I would have for Christian national or self-identified Christian nationalists is, well, how do you how do you plan on doing anything practical? Because you're still living in a democracy with laws and a constitution. And certainly our constitution would not permit you, even on the most whatever interpretation, to just deport all non-Christians. You just couldn't do that, or to jail them. I don't think that's just, or even have a state church, which some of them want a state church. So you'd have to how are you going to get there? Like, what is your practical action plan for getting enough voters to elect officials to get this Christian nation off the ground, or even a Christian city, or whatever you want? Okay. So here's how Wolfe semi-ends his book. He says, open blasphemy, in a chapter called The Right to Revolution. He writes this: open blasphemy in our public square is shrugged off as to be expected or part of the world's brokenness. We have settled into a posture of passive defense, bunkered down behind the artificial walls of churches and the porous borders separating the family from society. A hostile and secularist ruling class roams free, and few Christians are willing to take the struggle to a higher level. But we do not have to live like this. Here, I will justify violent revolution. Page 226. He then makes a standard just war argument for how, in principle, you could defend revolution. Like if just war says, if there are innocents being slaughtered and all these things, these conditions, and in principle, you could have a just war. And he says that applies to internal war as well, like civil war. If you're under a tyrant who's killing people, then you can rebel against him under just war theory. Here's his conclusion. He concludes, many want me to end with a word of caution, perhaps to reassure everyone that these are academic conclusions, that they are not serious. Instead, I'll say this: it is to our shame that we sheepishly tolerate assaults on our Christian heritage, merely sighing or tweeting performative outrage of republic blasphemy, impiety, irreverence, and perversity. We do not have to live like this, period. Okay, so he's not saying to start a violent revolution. He's not saying that, but he is saying that's on the table. Okay.
Wow.
Now, he's saying in principle it is, but he's not willing to say it's just in principle. He wants to make it clear he's not saying just in principle. He's saying, really, you ought to consider whether this is on the table. Okay. So, but my point, besides frightening you, Alisa, I also wanted to just point out that he is he is in some ways not the kind of person that Whitehead and Perry were thinking about in their book. Right. He's denying things like flags in churches and a political platform from the pulpit. He's saying we shouldn't do that. On the other hand, he's kind of exactly the people that Whitehead and Perry are targeting with their idea. And then actually a later book called The Flag and the Cross, which I have read, have not reviewed yet for various reasons. But they are claiming that, yes, actually radical Christian nationalists want violent revolution. And that's their thesis. And it's white Christian nationalists who are racist, who want to violently overthrow the government. Now, I'm just going to point out here that this is throwing fuel on the fire, in the sense of this is like their dream. They're like, please, someone write a book justifying violent revolution. Because then we can get all of our donors to give us money and to launch a war against Christian nationalism. And of course, they're going to broad brush everybody. And these in the progressive end is going to say, you're all Christian nationalists. We got to keep ourselves safe and defend democracy. And so anyone who voices an opinion about abortion or same-sex marriage or any of these cultural issues, you're a Christian nationalist who wants to overthrow the government. You have to be crushed or silenced. Okay, so my concern, I'm not a political theorist. I don't care about politics. I'll admit that. My big concern for the last 5 years has been wokeness, critical theory in the culture in the church. Number one concern, my concerns are theological. People are abandoning Jesus. People are abandoning good theology and embracing these terrible woke ideas that are obviously in step with progressive politics. Okay. That's our number one threat. Now is the time to lock arms as believers and work against wokeness in laws, in culture, in the church, right? I'm not locking arms with racists. I'm sorry. I will draw some lines. You have to be a believer. You have to, but we should be able to lock arms with, conservative. I mean, show me the conservative politician who would sign off on Wolfe's book. They're not even the most conservative politician is going to sign off on that. We're going to throw over to the Constitution. They're not signing up for that. So this movement is not, I guess, to be practical here, you're not going to launch this awesome, glorious Christian revolution. What you are likely, I mean, with God, all things are possible. I don't know. But what's more likely to happen is you're going to alienate lots of Christian conservatives who will run into the arms of the woke to escape this craziness. You will energize the woke and hand them the next 8 elections because they can point to you and say, look at the insanity you have to deal with. Okay. So I'm just saying, as someone who cares not about politics, but about theology, now is the time for conservative evangelicals to lock arms theologically and start standing up against wokeness, sure in laws, sure in the government, sure in culture, sure in education, but primarily in the church, instead of bounding off into Christian monarchy land. Okay, we have a more pressing threat. And this is where I think, again, consensus building is really important, coalition building, finding people who are conservative, but who are going to make incremental steps towards rooting out these ideas. So actually, my friend Josh Dawes had a great thread where he contrasts Christian nationalism, what he calls Project One, like Wolfe's project, with Christian federalism. And he would say Christian federalism is what you see in people like DeSantis, they just want to reassert a traditional American approach toward governance, a federalist approach to state power, getting activist teachers out of the schools, getting these activist curricula out of the schools. Now, that's a project people are getting behind, and it's making some progress. But you're going to alienate that nascent coalition if you start saying, no, we need a Christian monarch right now. We need to start getting guns. That's going to just tear this movement, this newly born movement, to shreds. Again, I'm not saying that because I care about politics. My main concern is you're going to have moderate pastors who are looking at, well, this woke stuff sounds pretty bad. Oh, you want to burn down the country and install a monarchy? Okay, no. I'm with the woke church. And I'm like, well, gosh, man, both choices are bad. Let's not do either.
But there are some in the Christian nationalist movement, though, Neil, that do want to do away with the Constitution.
Yes. Oh, I agree.
And then there are others who want a more gradualist approach. So I don't want to paint all Christian nationalists as having the same pathway to how we get there. But, I do think that there is a vulnerability as a reaction to, well, I want to be a biblically faithful pastor. I want to be a biblically faithful Christian. Wokeness is bad. But I think it's sending some of those people who are wanting to preserve biblical fidelity, I'm seeing them run into the arms of Christian nationalists because it is posing as the biblical alternative.
The only alternative.
Woke.
You're either woke or you're a Christian nationalist. And it's funny because it's like as of 3 years ago, this thing wasn't even existing 4 years ago. It's suddenly it's like there are only two choices. What happened? But yeah, to your point, Krista, I totally agree. So I agree that not all Christian nationalists, some of them would be horrified about some of the things that Wolfe says. Others would love it. Again, Josh Dawes tries to tease out those two factions. And his point is if you want to have a successful political movement, you've got to start focusing on incremental issues and not these overarching pie in the sky idealistic scenarios, because those are actually going to end up undermining the coalition you can build right now. Again, I'm not a pundit. I'm not here to give you political advice. My concern is I just think you're going to also, like you said, what's the other way is that you're going to, people that are just beginning to say, wait, maybe wokeness is a problem theologically, think about, well, that's a way bigger problem. So I'm just go ahead and not care about wokeness. I'm like, we're so close. Anyway.
Okay, so this has been utterly fascinating, and I want to direct everybody to further resources. For sure, go to shenviapologetics.com to get Neil's very in-depth review of this book. And if you're on Twitter, I got off Twitter because it's a sewer. I admire you, Neil, that you're still duking it out on there. But if you're on Twitter, follow Neil. Lots of great resources. He's always, challenging the status quo, and it's interesting to see the reaction. Sometimes I'll just go peek and see what's going on Twitter. And I want to end with this, and I'm going to let each of you kind of have a last word here. So anything else that's just burning in your heart that you want to say. But I'd like to say this. I am very sympathetic with the instinct to be apolitical, to just duck out and be like, this is all crazy. I'm just going to live my life. I'm not going to get involved. I'm not going to worry about it. I am actually incredibly sympathetic to that instinct. And I think if I was just left to my nature, I would probably be that way. But the Lord has actually convicted me just in this past year or so that, if we're apolitical, then we're not actually contributing to being a solution to the problem. And our politics should flow out of our theology. And we should be involved in such a way that we are protecting the most amount of people and doing the best we can to help usher in good and moral laws. And I'm still just starting to think about this stuff more deeply. I do want to direct our audience to a 2-part series I did a few months ago on Christianity and politics. It was a 2-part series about how to think theologically about politics with Dr. Jeff Myers from Summit Ministries. And then we did an episode with Oz Guinness and just kind of did a little 2-part on that. If anybody wants more resources on how to think through these things as a Christian. And with that said, Krista, take a minute or two. What are you dying for our audience to know about this, or what other resources would you direct them to? And then I'll let Neil have the last word.
Yeah, I have several teaching series related to politics on my channel. So they can go to Theology Mom on YouTube, and there's a playlist there on Christianity and politics. And I've done several teaching series along these lines with how my thoughts have developed so far and walking people through that. And I do want to encourage people to stay engaged in the political conversation. We live in a very unique moment in history. The most of human history has been one of tyrants and difficulty and dictatorships, and we live in a very unique time of the great American experiment of a constitutional republic. I'm not ready to blow that up, and I want to figure out a way forward. I'm sympathetic with my theonomist friends who want to preserve biblical fidelity. I'm very sympathetic with that. I don't in any way want to paint them as fringe or crazy, because I really think in their heart they want to be biblically faithful. I also think that political philosophy is something in the amount of pluralistic society that we're currently living in is we're on a steep kind of learning curve and trying to figure this out in a very difficult time frame. And I just want to encourage people to go a little slower and not be so quick to pick sides. And I'm really trusting the Lord to bring some voices forward, to innovate and provide clarity. I'm not ready to fully put the first 4 commandments of the 10 commandments into civil law, but I'm sympathetic and I understand those people who want to be biblically faithful, and they do think that there should be laws against other religions. I don't think I agree with that, but I would be hard pressed right now to give a super detailed answer to that. And so that would be my other thing I want to tell people is it's okay to be thinking about it. It's okay to be learning. It's okay to not have it all ironed out, because these are complicated issues. And I appreciate that Wolfe has put forward his framework. I invite others to put forth their frameworks. I am all for a competition of ideas.
Neil.
Yeah, I think I just have some questions. I think, even the craziest ideas and frameworks, they should make you re-examine why you believe what you believe, right? So like Krista said, when a Christian nationalist says, for example, or like Wolfe says, we should be legislating the first table in the first 4 or 5, commandments, not just the second table, not just the murder and adultery. We should legislate all 10 commandments. And I say, no, you shouldn't. You say, well, why not? I'm kind of like, I don't know. Well, good. See, that's a good thing. It's making me ask, well, why do I believe that? Am I even being consistent here? So I think I truly believe that a lot of our evangelical political pundits have never really thought about the deep first principles behind their political stances. They kind of just go with the flow like I do. Everyone does. So I think it's books like these force you to make a biblical case for what you believe and even to re-examine what you believe. So I'm for that. So I think it's one good thing to think about. So I think in the same way, I think that when Christian nationalists say we have to enforce all 10 commandments, well, they should make a case too. Oftentimes their reasoning will reveal, major principles like, well, is there discontinuity or continuity between the Old Testament and New Testament? The basic theological principles that are illuminated by how they reason about government and law, for example. So I think these are all healthy things. But I would say one of the things that Wolfe says repeatedly in his book that is not brought out more, and especially is not evident in a lot of the reasoning of professing Christian nationalists on Twitter, which is a small population, I guess. But Wolfe really emphasizes the need for prudence. What he keeps saying is that in this book, this is the ideal situation. And I'm like, okay, so the ideal situation is a Christian prince who loves God, who's going to execute biblical justice, etc. But in one sense, though, a ideal case would also be a wholly regenerate Christian population. In other words, thought experiment. Wolfe's book actually makes a lot of sense if we're talking about 1,000 Christians who go and colonize Mars. Mm-hmm. What are their laws going to be? They're all Reformed evangelical Christians, Presbyterians. They land on Mars. I'd actually be like, well, this is not crazy for them. They all want it. When I hate living under a government that said you can't blaspheme Jesus, I'm like, I wouldn't hate that. Actually, that'd be fine. I don't blaspheme Jesus, hopefully. So if it's the consent of the governed saying we actually want to obey God's law, then what's wrong with that? This is what the Puritans were doing. They came here because they wanted to escape and have this freedom to have their religious convictions lived out in law. So my point is, the ideal that Wolfe's envisioning is also, I think, implicitly assumes a largely Christian believing populace. And he recognizes repeatedly that in the reality of a largely pluralistic non-Christian populace, you will have to make concessions. Ironically, the sort of popularizers of Christian nationalism don't seem to get that. They're the ones shouting, ban Hindu temples and deport all non-Christians. But he's not really saying that because it's always for him been about the ideal. And then but he keeps saying prudentially in practice, this looks very different for every nation. We have to adjust. What will people tolerate? What can they support? We don't want to create a revolution. We don't want to create violence. We want to be gentle and push people gently, things like that. So, and he's actually a lot more down to earth and realistic than some of these really extreme voices. So again, I'm not saying he doesn't say extreme things, but I'm saying, hey, we should at least embrace that thinking. There's need to be compromise and prudence in how you govern. And actually, that's way built into the tradition that he's citing. The reformers did believe in that kind of, prudence, care, slowness, hesitancy. They believed in that. So I think we should, if we're not reject everything else he says, at least acknowledge that he's saying that, and we should take it seriously too.
Well, lots to think about. I'd like to thank my co-host, Krista Bontrager, and our guest, Neil Shenvi. Again, go to shenviapologetics.com for more on this topic and check out Krista's Theology Mom podcast and YouTube channel and Facebook page. If you are looking for some deeper education, some higher level education, I want to recommend Southern Evangelical Seminary. I am currently a student at SES. I'm loving my classes. I'm learning so much. I love that SES has a three-pronged approach to all of their classes. Every single class they teach is approached from the disciplines of theology, philosophy, and apologetics. If you're interested in learning more, go to ses.edu/Alisa. You can download a free book, check out the options there, ses.edu/Alisa. If you're watching on YouTube, as always, it helps if you subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. If you're listening on audio platforms, if you'll go over to those platforms and rate us and give us a review, it's so helpful. Of course, posting on social media is always helpful as well. And let's remember that as we pursue Christ, let's keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin. We'll see you next time.